I never expected a bus ride to feel like this, like the world had shrunk down to the two of us, vibrating between stolen glances and the faint warmth she carried with her. She sat across from me, a graceful woman in her mid-40s, the kind of woman who seemed untouchable at first, but somehow approachable. Maybe it was the way her hair caught the light, or the faint scent of her perfume, soft and floral, that clung to the edges of my senses like a whispered secret. She shifted in her seat, and I noticed the careful elegance in her movements. Her hand brushed the strap of her bag, and without looking, my fingers twitched slightly, catching the edge of her sleeve. A spark, subtle, almost imaginary, but unmistakable. I cleared my throat, pretending to check my phone, while my heart stubbornly refused to settle. "Don't tell anyone you're with me," she whispered suddenly, leaning close, so close that the warmth of her shoulder brushed mine. Her voice was soft, low, yet somehow carrying that authority that made me want to obey. The words weren't a command, they were an invitation, a confession wrapped in caution. I wanted to say something, anything, but my mouth felt empty, my thoughts scattered. I just nodded, hoping my silence wasn't obvious, though I was acutely aware of her proximity, the subtle rise and fall of her breath. I could smell the faint hint of coffee lingering from earlier, the faint trace of lavender in her hair. It was intoxicating, not just the smell, but the way she existed in the same space as me, making everything else fade. Her eyes flicked toward the window, then back at me, holding mine for just a moment too long. There was an unspoken understanding in that look, the kind that doesn't need words. My chest tightened. She noticed it, I was sure. There was that tiny smirk, almost imperceptible, like she knew the effect she had, and maybe liked it. I tried to focus on the hum of the bus, the jostle of passengers, the rhythmic rattle of tires, but it all blended into the background, muffled by the tension that had grown between us. Every small movement, the brush of her hand against the edge of her bag, the way her scarf shifted slightly over her shoulder, felt deliberate, magnetic. My fingers itched to touch, to close the invisible gap, yet every instinct told me to wait, to respect the fragile line we were treading. "You're quiet today," she murmured, leaning just a fraction closer. I could feel the warmth of her arm pressing against mine, the faint sway of the bus carrying us subtly together. My throat tightened, my words seemed to evaporate before they could form. I'm just noticing. I finally managed, my voice low, uncertain, betraying more than I intended. "Noticing what?" she asked, though her lips curved slightly in amusement, and her eyes didn't wait for an answer. She was testing me, and I was caught, exposed. The bus lurched slightly, and she leaned in to steady herself, or perhaps it was an excuse to close the distance just a little more. My pulse raced, a wild rhythm I couldn't control. For a moment, it felt like we were suspended, two strangers in the same bubble, the world outside irrelevant. Then the sudden jolt of the door opening broke the spell. A gust of cool air swept in, rustling her hair. She glanced toward the newcomer, and I felt that fragile, suspended moment snap. Her hand lingered near mine, inches apart, a silent promise, a question unanswered. And then she leaned back, just enough to remind me she existed in her own world too, leaving me staring, wanting, and completely unprepared for what came next. The bus rumbled on, a steady vibration beneath us, and yet it felt like the world outside had slowed, letting me watch her more closely than I probably should. There was something fragile about her, a quiet sadness tucked beneath the confident gestures she gave the world. I noticed the faint crease near her temple, the slight downturn of her lips when she thought no one was looking. She carried herself like she had been through storms but learned to make them look effortless, and maybe that was part of why I was drawn to her. I remembered a snippet she had mentioned once, nothing concrete, just a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes, a fleeting mention of someone she'd loved and lost years ago. I didn't pry, but I caught it all. The way she flinched slightly at sudden noise, the way she kept her hands busy, smoothing her skirt or brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. It told me more than any words could. She was careful, cautious, and maybe scared of letting someone in. And yet, here she was, leaning just close enough that the warmth from her body brushed mine. My hand twitched, brushing against the back of hers accidentally, or maybe not. The line between accident and intention was hazy, charged. I wanted to pull back, to respect the unspoken boundaries, but every instinct in me wanted to linger, to feel that closeness for just a second longer. There was a risk here, a tension that neither of us fully admitted. I was young, inexperienced in comparison to her. People might judge, whisper about the age gap, about the impropriety of it all. And yet, whenever she smiled at me, or caught me staring just a fraction too long, it felt impossible to care about what anyone else might think. The risk itself added weight, made the tension more delicious, more urgent. She shifted again, bringing her hand near mine as if she had forgotten to move it, but I caught it in the corner of my eye. My fingers itched to brush against hers deliberately, but I kept still, letting the air between us tremble. Her gaze met mine, just for a heartbeat, and she seemed to notice the small tremor in my jaw, the way my shoulders stiffened. "You're quiet today," she said again, her voice softer this time, almost hesitant, and it made my stomach tighten. I wanted to say something clever, something that would explain why my heart was racing, but no words came. I guess I'm thinking," I admitted finally, knowing it was weak, that it revealed too much, but I couldn't stop myself. She laughed softly, a sound like silk brushing against glass, and leaned closer, not to speak, not quite, but just enough that her breath brushed my cheek. My pulse spiked. Her presence was overwhelming, intoxicating, and I was painfully aware of it, aware of how her perfume curled around me like a private spell. There was a silence that stretched between us, not uncomfortable, but charged. I caught myself imagining her in ways I shouldn't, imagining her hand resting on mine, imagining the warmth of her arm along mine, the curve of her shoulder pressing into mine while we talked about something trivial. It was a dangerous daydream, but it wouldn't leave me. She noticed. Of course she did. There was a flicker in her eyes, soft, unreadable. But when she let her hand linger just a fraction too long on the seat between us, I felt it like an electric current. Neither of us moved away, either of us crossed the invisible line either. The tension hummed, like the bus itself was holding its breath for us. "You shouldn't be noticing me like that," she murmured, almost to herself, though I felt the words land heavily on me. Her voice was barely audible over the rumble of the tires, but I understood. She was teasing, testing, maybe warning me. And I, foolishly, gladly, leaned just a fraction closer, catching her gaze again. For a moment, nothing else existed, not the other passengers, not the social rules, not the questions of what-ifs. Only her hand near mine, only the heat of her presence, only the silent acknowledgement that something dangerous and beautiful was growing between us. Then the bus hit a small bump, and she flinched, her hand brushing mine in the movement. I didn't pull away. I didn't let her move away either. We stayed like that for a heartbeat too long, sharing an electricity we couldn't name but neither of us would deny. And in that suspended second, I knew, whatever came next, this connection wasn't fading. It was only beginning. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the bus windows, painting stripes across her face, and I couldn't look away. Every line, every subtle shift of her expression was a study I could have traced for hours. She was leaning slightly forward, elbows resting on her knees, and her gaze flicked to me just often enough to make my pulse skip. Then a vibration on my phone jolted me back, a sudden, unwelcome reminder of the outside world. I fumbled to silence it, and she noticed. Her eyes sharpened, a small frown tugging at her lips, but there was something more, an unspoken question. "Everything okay?" she murmured, leaning just a little closer, so that her shoulder brushed mine. My chest tightened. Yeah, just a message," I mumbled, hoping the casual tone covered the rapid beat of my heart. Her fingers twitched against the edge of her bag, almost absent-mindedly, yet every micro-movement screamed attention. I noticed the way her thumb lingered near her lips, the way she tilted her head slightly when she watched me. I wanted, needed, to reach out, to close that tiny gap, but a flicker of caution held me back. The bus swerved slightly, and we both steadied ourselves, her hand grazing mine just enough to make me flinch inwardly. My eyes met hers, and there it was, the silent acknowledgement of what was growing between us, something forbidden, something exhilarating. But then, footsteps. A voice. I heard a laugh from a friend I recognized on the street outside the bus stop. She stiffened slightly beside me, and my stomach twisted. The moment was fragile, suspended, and now a third presence loomed in the background, even if just in memory. We sat in silence, breaths shallow, hearts probably thudding the same erratic rhythm. I imagined what it would feel like to lean just a little closer, to close the last few inches that separated us. Her lips, soft and inviting, seemed almost within reach, and yet I didn't. She didn't. We both seemed caught between desire and restraint, knowing the line we were tiptoeing around. I shouldn't. She started, her voice barely above a whisper. Her gaze fell to her hands, fidgeting with the strap of her bag, and I sensed the battle she fought, wanting to lean closer, wanting to touch, wanting something. Shouldn't what? I asked softly, even though I already knew the answer. The words hung in the air, incomplete, a near confession neither of us could voice fully. Her breath brushed against my cheek as she shifted again, an almost accidental movement that left our knees touching. My hand twitched, hovering near hers, and I swallowed hard, the air between us thick with possibility. The heat of her body pressed against mine just slightly, a spark igniting somewhere deep inside, impossible to ignore. I can't, she finally said, though her eyes betrayed the lie. She wasn't moving away. She wasn't trying to create distance either. I leaned closer, carefully, tentatively, just enough that our foreheads nearly touched. Every heartbeat felt like a drum between us, every second stretched into eternity. My lips hovered, almost brushing against hers, yet something, guilt, fear, a flicker of reason, kept me from crossing that last threshold. She mirrored me, leaning in without fully committing, her eyes searching mine, her lips trembling ever so slightly. The tension was unbearable, electric. And then, before anything could happen, the bus jerked again. Our foreheads brushed fully this time, a flash of warmth that left me dizzy. Her hand, which had hovered at the edge of my arm, finally settled there, pressing lightly, insistently. We didn't speak. We didn't move. But the closeness, dangerous, intoxicating, undeniable, pulled us together more than ever. For a suspended moment, the world outside ceased to exist, and only the magnetic weight of each other's presence mattered. The late afternoon sunlight slanted sharply across the bus aisle, turning ordinary dust motes into a golden haze. She was sitting closer than usual, knees brushing mine, her elbow nudging me lightly as she shifted. My pulse had been building all day, but now it felt like it was hammering in my chest. Every second stretched impossibly long, the air between us thick with what we weren't saying. I can't stop thinking about you, I finally whispered, my voice low, almost a shiver. The words came out before I could stop them, raw and uncontrolled. I saw her freeze, her eyes widening, her lips parting slightly. For a heartbeat, everything halted, the murmur of other passengers, the hum of the engine, even the sunlight seemed to hold its breath. She didn't pull back, though every instinct in me expected her to. Instead, her gaze softened, a quiet surrender in the way she looked at me. You shouldn't, she murmured, voice trembling just enough to betray her own storm beneath the calm exterior. She reached a hand toward my hair, brushing it back from my forehead with a touch so gentle it made my skin tingle. The warmth of her fingers lingered, an electric reminder of how close we were. I don't care, I admitted, swallowing hard, the words rough in my throat. I can't. Not anymore. My hand hovered near hers, aching to close the distance, to feel her fully, to let the restraint break entirely. Her chest pressed subtly against mine as she leaned forward, the faint scent of her perfume enveloping me. It was floral, warm, intoxicating, something I could lose myself in for hours. She inhaled sharply, and I felt it against my cheek, against my lips, and the sudden nearness sent a shock through me. Do you know how dangerous this is? She whispered, her voice close enough to brush my ear. Do you know what people will think, What it could cost? Her fingers traced a slow, almost casual line along my arm, and I could feel the tension coiling between us, impossible to ignore. I don't care what it costs, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I wanted to reach for her, to close the tiny distance, to finally let her know how much I'd been holding back. My heart thumped violently, and for a moment I imagined closing my eyes and... The bus jolted over a pothole, and she gasped softly, pressing her hand against my chest as if steadying herself, or maybe testing me. I didn't move away. I couldn't. Our faces were inches apart, and I could see the faint tremor in her lips, the warmth in her eyes, the hesitation that was slowly melting. I shouldn't. She started, but the words faltered, swallowed by the tension that had built like a storm. Her hand lingered on my arm, brushing upward slightly, and I felt the tiny spark of electricity shoot straight through me. I want you, I whispered, my voice hoarse, not even trying to hide the desire I had buried for weeks. Her breath hitched. The faint exhale of her lips brushed against mine. My chest rose and fell, my hands trembling slightly, my mind screaming to close the last inch, to finally let the long-held yearning explode into something undeniable. She leaned forward, just a fraction closer. I leaned toward her at the same time. Time slowed. The world outside the bus disappeared, leaving only the heat between us, the quiet electricity, the brush of her hair against my cheek, the tentative pressure of her hand against my arm. And then... a sudden shout from the street outside, a horn blaring, a figure stepping onto the bus. Her eyes snapped to the interruption, wide, startled. My heart lurched, our suspended moment shattered, but the closeness remained, palpable, almost unbearable. She didn't move away completely. Neither did I. We were trapped on the edge, teetering between surrender and restraint, every nerve alive, every breath held. The question hung unspoken: would we cross the line, or would the world intervene first? The bus had emptied a little, leaving the late afternoon light to stretch across the worn seats like a golden blanket. She was still near me, though now there was a subtle distance, the kind that made my chest ache with both longing and frustration. I had been replaying our near confession over and over in my mind, every brush of her hand, every whispered word, every stolen glance. Then, as if the universe wanted to punish me for my foolish thoughts, my phone buzzed again. A message. I glanced down, expecting a routine notification, but it wasn't. It was from my roommate. Saw you with her earlier, on the bus. Are you serious? My stomach dropped. I hadn't realized anyone could have noticed, and now the fragile bubble between us felt dangerously thin. I looked up at her, panicked, trying to gauge if she'd seen my reaction. She was quiet, but her body shifted slightly, as if she had felt the tension radiating from me. Her hands trembled lightly as she smoothed the edge of her scarf, and I noticed the subtle tightening of her jaw. Someone saw us, I whispered, unsure if I should speak it aloud. Her eyes widened, a flash of alarm crossing her usually composed features. She leaned back slightly, creating a small space between us, but the movement was hesitant, and I could feel the residual warmth from her shoulder lingering against mine. They shouldn't know, she murmured, her voice low, almost fragile. I swallowed hard. The thought of someone watching, of judgment creeping into our private bubble, sent a shiver down my spine. And yet, the tension between us didn't break. If anything, it sharpened, made every small touch feel more dangerous, more delicious. Her hand brushed against mine almost accidentally as she adjusted her bag, and I froze, aware of how every brush now carried the weight of risk. I didn't want anyone to see, she admitted, and her eyes met mine, glimmering with something unspoken. There was vulnerability there, but also defiance, a quiet claim that this, us, was worth the danger. I wanted to reach for her, to close the distance, but hesitation gnawed at me. The rules, the age gap, the whispered warnings in the back of my mind, they all screamed at me to stop. Yet my body betrayed me, leaning just slightly toward her, craving the warmth of her presence, the soft brush of her hand, the faint scent of her perfume that made everything else fade. She noticed. Of course she did. Her chest shifted, almost brushing mine, and I felt the tremor of her breath, the subtle tension in her fingers as they brushed past mine while reaching for her seat strap. Every nerve in me was alive, aware of how close we were and how perilous this had become. "I don't want to hide any more," she whispered, so close that her lips almost touched my ear. The words were soft, tremulous, but they carried an intensity that made my heart stutter. My throat went dry, my hands itched to close the last few inches that separated us. A sudden shiver ran through her as the bus hit a bump, and our shoulders pressed fully together, sending an electric thrill through me. I couldn't look away. She didn't pull back, even though her fingers trembled slightly as they brushed my arm. For a suspended second, we existed in a bubble of danger, desire, and confession, a world where nothing else mattered but the unspoken tension that bound us. And then she leaned just a fraction closer, eyes searching mine for permission, for understanding, for something neither of us could yet name. "I don't care who sees," she whispered, her lips barely brushing against my hair. The confession, simple as it was, tore through every restraint I had left. Time seemed to pause. The risk, the secrecy, the danger, it only made the pull between us stronger, more urgent. My chest tightened, my hands trembled, and every instinct screamed to close the distance. But we stayed on the knife's edge, caught between desire and fear, between what was right and what we both craved too desperately to resist. And in that suspended heartbeat, I knew a choice had to be made. One way or another, we were about to cross a line that couldn't be undone. The bus had slowed to a crawl, crawling along the narrow streets as the sun dipped low, casting a warm, golden haze across her face. She sat so close now that the space between us felt non-existent, our knees brushing, our shoulders barely apart. I could feel her breath against my cheek, subtle and intoxicating, a rhythm that matched the pulse thudding in my chest. "I don't know if we should," she whispered, though her voice was low, almost a sigh. The hesitation in her tone only made my resolve wobble. I could see the tension in her fingers as they rested near mine, trembling just enough to betray the calm she tried to wear. "I know," I said, voice rough, barely above a whisper. "But I can't step back." My hand hovered near hers, aching to bridge the gap, to make the unspoken tangible. She inhaled sharply, leaning just a fraction closer, and I felt the heat of her shoulder press against mine. The world outside the bus didn't exist anymore. Every gaze, every sound, every bump in the road faded into the background. It was just her, just me, suspended in a moment that was impossibly fragile and impossibly alive. Her lips parted slightly as she searched my eyes, and I read everything in that glance: fear, longing, defiance, vulnerability. She wanted this as much as I did, but she was still balancing on the edge of restraint. I swallowed, my throat tight, and let my hand brush against hers, lightly, almost tentatively, letting the connection speak where words could not. "I can't hide how I feel anymore," I murmured. "Not from you. Not from myself." Her eyes softened, a subtle tremor passing through her, and she leaned into my hand, pressing lightly, almost imperceptibly, as if testing the boundary. The air between us vibrated, electric, heavy with desire and fear and everything we had kept locked away. "I shouldn't," she started, then faltered, letting the sentence trail off into the silence. That silence wasn't empty, it was full of unspoken confession, of acknowledgement that whatever choice we made now could change everything. I leaned slightly closer, our foreheads nearly touching, and felt the warmth of her breath, the faint brush of her hair across my cheek. Her hand, still resting against mine, tightened just a fraction, and I knew she had made her choice, even without words. "I don't care," she whispered finally, voice trembling but certain. "I don't care what anyone thinks. I want this." It was all the permission I needed. I closed the remaining distance gently, carefully, letting the intensity of our proximity carry the weight of our longing. We didn't rush. There were no grand declarations, just the quiet surrender of two people who had held back for far too long, finally letting themselves be seen. Her hand slid over mine, fingers curling lightly, and I felt a shiver run through her. Our breaths mingled, soft and uneven, and for the first time, I could see every hidden corner of her fears, her vulnerabilities, her unspoken desires, and I understood her fully. I brushed a lock of hair from her face, my fingers trembling slightly, and she leaned into the touch, just enough to press her cheek against my hand. It was intimate, raw, human, not perfect, not polished, but entirely real. We stayed like that for a long moment, suspended in a quiet understanding, the tension finally resolved but the energy between us still crackling. No words were needed, we didn't have to say anything. The choice had been made, the line crossed, and yet everything was just beginning. For the first time, I felt clarity. I knew her, and she knew me. And in that knowledge, in that surrender, there was a sense of peace and inevitability that made my chest ache with something I had never allowed myself to feel before: certainty, connection, and something dangerously beautiful called trust. The evening had fallen softly over the city, the streets bathed in a gentle amber glow from the streetlights. The bus had long since emptied, leaving only us in the quiet hum of its engine as we rode toward our shared, unspoken destination. She sat close beside me now, her hand resting lightly over mine, fingers intertwining without ceremony. The warmth of her touch felt like it had always been meant to be there, a quiet claim, a reassurance. I looked at her, really looked, at the way her eyes softened when she smiled, at the tiny creases that formed at the corners, at the subtle shiver of her breath whenever our fingers brushed. The hesitation, the fear, the what-ifs, they all seemed to dissolve in that simple, human connection. "I never thought," she murmured, leaning her head slightly toward my shoulder, "that I could feel this way again." "You don't have to think," I replied, letting my thumb brush over her knuckles. "We're here. That's enough." Her laugh was quiet, almost a sigh, and she rested her head fully against my shoulder. I felt the subtle rise and fall of her breath, the comforting weight of her presence. There was no need for grand gestures or words. Everything had been said in the tiny, intimate touches: the hand on the arm, the brush of hair from her face, the tremor in her lips when she leaned into me. The age gap, the whispered warnings, the judgments that might exist outside the bubble of this moment, they didn't matter anymore. What mattered was this: the honesty in her gaze, the softness in her voice, the warmth of her hand pressed into mine. "I was afraid," she whispered after a moment. "Afraid it would be too much, or wrong." "Nothing about this is wrong," I said, turning slightly so I could meet her eyes. "It's messy, yes. It's complicated. But it's real." She smiled, that quiet, genuine smile that made the world shrink until it felt like it existed only for us. Then, almost on impulse, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to mine. The contact was electric, intimate, grounding. I closed my eyes, letting the closeness settle over me, letting the quiet electricity ease into a calm warmth. We stayed like that for a long while, foreheads pressed together, hands entwined, breathing in sync. The rush of desire had softened into something deeper: trust, understanding, companionship. The tension that had driven us, that had made every glance and touch charged with danger, had finally been released, not in a dramatic explosion, but in the simple act of allowing ourselves to exist together, fully, honestly. When the bus finally came to a stop at my street, she didn't pull away. We stepped off together, still holding hands, and the cool night air did nothing to break the warmth we carried between us. A quiet laugh escaped her as we walked, our steps unconsciously matching, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. At the door to her apartment she paused. I looked at her, at the slight hesitation, the flicker of lingering doubt. Then she tilted her head and pressed her lips softly to my forehead, a gentle, grounding kiss that spoke of promises, trust, and beginnings. I felt the weight of it settle into me, a reassurance that whatever came next, we had this moment, this bond. "See you tomorrow?" I whispered. She smiled against my shoulder. "Yes, tomorrow." And as we finally parted for the night, I knew that the fragile, impossible spark between us had become something undeniable and real. Something worth holding.